Lee joined Digital Science in 2014 as VP Academic and Research Relations and VP North America to manage the U.S. offices and develop commercial policy and research relationships with North America research institutions. From 2008 to 2013, she worked at Harvard University, first as Program Manager of the Office for Scholarly Communication and then as Assistant Provost for Faculty Appointments and Information. Before moving to Harvard, she held long-term positions as an Executive Editor at the MIT Press and as Director of Business and Product Development at Crossref. She is a founding member of the ORCID Board of Directors and regularly serves in advisory roles for key community initiatives at Digital Scholar Center. She holds a BA in Linguistics from Barnard College and a PhD in Cognitive Science from MIT.
Thank you, and thanks, Rebecca, for your laptop. Actually, the irony here is that I wanted to use my laptop because I wanted to have access to my notes, but the way this is displaying, I don't anyway, so, but that will be fine. So I'm going to talk about authorship, credit, and attribution from the perspective of contribution. We've been talking about attribution earlier today in terms of licenses, and here we're going to look at attribution in terms of specific contribution to scholarship. So I work at Digital Science, and this isn't really directly relevant to what Digital Science does, but Digital Science supports it because if we're successful in doing this, it really has, I think, the promise to provide a foundation for a whole new type of research metrics. So the subtitle of this talk could well be Giving Credit Where Credit is Due. And I love this particular PhD comic because it riffs on how political often new sequences become. So you can see the third author here is the first-year student who actually did the experiments, performed the analysis, and wrote the paper, but thinks that being third author is fair, right? And the last author is the head honcho, hasn't even read the paper, but hey, he got the funding and his famous name will get the paper accepted. It's pretty funny, but it's actually really quite true. It's really detrimental, I think, to younger scientists. As it turns out, the order of authorship, in the case of multi-authored works, and collaboration and multi-authorship is growing, has no consistent agreed-upon meaning, and typically does not clarify the contribution to the research in question. So the result is that credit is often not given where credit is due. So what do we mean by credit? Well, if your name appears on a paper as an author, you're going to get credit for that paper. You can include it in your CV. The position of your name in a list of authors doesn't affect your citation counts or your H index. However, it does affect, I think, the more subjective ways and unsystematic ways in which people read citation. Credit actually does get divided. Part of it boils down to the way we present bibliographic citations and as they're interpreted by people as opposed to by machines. And so typically in our citation styles, if you have 50 names on a paper, you're not going to include all of those names in the citation. So here's an example of APA style. The first 6 authors, the last author are included, but not anybody in between. And this was a paper with over 50 authors. So if you're author number 10 or 40, your name is not readily discoverable when your colleagues encounter this reference in the literature. And on the other hand, our conventions are such that we tend to value the first and last author position most, but we just saw how the sequence is easily gained, and so that these priority positions are not, in fact, a reliable reflection of actual contribution. Hence, the tea leaves. I mean, interpreting author sequence is like reading tea leaves. And readers, including the appointment and funding evaluators, whose opinions really matter to researchers, are implicitly apportioning credit in the absence of any well-defined standards. So they're part of the system that is wittingly or unwittingly selecting scientists and scholars on the basis of political clout or negotiating skill that won them the first and last author position. Again, very detrimental to junior researchers. Now, the number of authors per paper is indeed increasing. Just a quick literature search and you come across paper titles like this, The Demise of the Lone Author. Sole authorship was the norm until about the 1920s. Today, shared authorship is quite common in most academic disciplines. We even see shared authorship increasing in the humanities, and it is steadily rising. I think understanding why that's happening is an interesting question too. Is it the result of network communications, or funding trends? But that's the focus of another talk. So consider the growth in mean number of authors per paper between 2006 and 2013 in these 6 PLOS journals. In PLOS Medicine, for example, we see the average number of authors during that time span going from just under 5 to just under 8. And these graphs were taken from a site called Our Bloggers. Or consider publications in particle physics like this one about the Atlas experiment at CERN. Almost 3,000 authors, and they're listed as last name, first initial. So at, say, author number 1,500, not only are you a needle in a haystack, but you're a needle in a haystack without a unique name, right? And that's the problem that ORCID was intended to solve for us. It's a different but related type of attribution failure. Drummond Rennie, who's a longtime JAMA editor known for his work on publication ethics, put it well when he wrote, I think with a couple of co-authors in 1997, the system of authorship, while appropriate for articles with only one author, has become inappropriate as author number has increased, co-authors have become more specialized, the relationships between them have become complex, and both credit and even more responsibility have become obscured and diluted. But who gets credit for research and discovery has a huge impact on people's lives. It affects career advancement and tenure, and it affects the transparency and integrity of the scholarly record. So why do we in academic publishing persist in a system in which the incentives and conventions for authorship, attribution, citation, and credit are so dysfunctional? Academic disputes abound. The Committee on Publication Ethics in the UK, COPE, exists to provide editors and publishers with advice on all aspects of publication ethics, cases of dispute and misconduct. This particular case, you probably can't see it, concerns an author who is asserting rights to authorship that others don't agree with. Author says that the individual making a complaint about their right to authorship does not deserve to be an author. Similarly, in this case, authors X and Y hold similar views as to what author-wise contribution was, but different views as to whether this is sufficient for authorship. And this highlights the important point that the question of what constitutes authorship is indeed orthogonal to what, clarifying credit and contribution. Usually in discussions about authorship and contributorship, the ICMJE recommendations come to the fore. But those recommendations are really just criteria for authorship, and you see them spelled out here. Substantial contributions, drafting the work, final approval, agreement to be accountable to all aspects of the work. So anybody who's participated in a paper but does not meet all 4 of these criteria is considered a contributor rather than an author. But that falls short of actually specifying what are the types of contribution that consistently contribute to papers in science and scholarship. It's not what those recommendations were intended to do. And so authorship and contributorship are distinct constructs, and yet enforcing transparency around contribution will go a long way towards mitigating the types of authorship abuse that we see today, and you can see them spelled out here. Coercion authorship, use of intimidation tactics to gain authorship, honorary or guest authorship, mutual support authorship, agreement by 2 or more investigators to place their names on each other's papers, duplication authorship, publishing the same work in multiple journals, we see that, ghost authorship, and denial of authorship, which is really what we're talking about here, publication of work carried out by others without providing them credit for their work with authorship or formal acknowledgement. So again, these are all different, but highlight the lack of transparency and accountability. So as author lists grow in length, the problem intensifies. On a lighter note, celebrating how absurd this has become, before the announcement of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2013, there was a satirical posting in Scientific American's blog reporting that the prize committee had awarded the Nobel Prize to the Higgs boson particle itself because it wasn't clear which of the 6,000 people involved in this project could claim credit for the particle's discovery. We generally think of fields where the order of authors does not default to alphabetical as being the ones where there's more politics around the name sequence, like we saw in the comic strip. However, in fields like mathematics and economics, in which the author name order always is alphabetical, or defaults to alphabetical, and so therefore we presume that all contributions are considered equal, it's actually been shown that you are more likely to get tenure in an elite department or win an elite prize, like the Nobel Prize, if your last name begins with a letter earlier in the alphabet. So say if you are Professor Altman versus Professor Zelaznik as a publishing economist, you're much better off. And so the unintended consequences of author name order are funny, but not benign, and they apply a selective pressure on some last names over others. I personally became interested in this topic when I was working at Harvard on tenure and promotion a few years ago. I was looking at the case of a biostatistician from the School of Public Health who was coming up for tenure, and there was a disconnect between the views of his scholarship as communicated by the peer reviewers who said, leading light in his field, and you have to be a leading light in your field to get tenure at Harvard, and what his publication record looked like, because it was almost exclusively multi-authored papers in which he was a middle author. And I knew from experience that this case would be really hard for the Presidential Tenure Committee to work its way through and adjudicate. So what I wished for on his behalf was that his formal publication record would somehow capture the fact that he was the lead contributor on all of these papers when it came to unique statistical methodology. And so I started doing a survey of policies in various journals, and I found that several, especially on the biomedical side, had some controlled vocabularies around types of contribution. You can see AACR here, and I think the other is PLOS, conception and design, development and methodology, acquisition of data, drafting, revising the article. These were the sorts of terms that were showing up. And other journals, such as Nature, for example, had just a requirement that all authors include a contribution statement, but in free text form. So, it occurred to me that if we could get publishers to converge on a standard set of contribution tags, that we could actually spread the practice of capturing contribution and actually turn this into machine-readable information. In other words, metadata. And I also discovered that several of my close colleagues were very interested in this topic as well. Among them, Dan Scott-Lichter, who's here, Michael Altman from the MIT Libraries now, Liz Allen of the Wellcome Trust, Veronique Hermer of Nature, Margie Blaga of Access Innovations. And we held a workshop back in May of 2012 at Harvard, sponsored by the Wellcome Trust, and then decided to embark on this long project of actually creating a standard taxonomy of contribution. The first step was analyzing free text acknowledgement statements and author contribution statements. The bulk of the data we worked with was 5 years of free text author contribution statements from Nature. And that was work that was conducted by Michael Altman. So you've seen these whorls before. The size of the words and the diagram is proportional to the frequency with which the word appears in the contribution statement, and things that jump out: analyze, experiments, write, perform, data, contributed, etc., are pretty good indicators of the things that people contribute when they're part of a published research project. So we used this and some other data from Elsevier to draft a strawman taxonomy, and we ran a pilot in which we got the authors of 200 recently published papers from Nature, PLOS, and Elsevier to use the taxonomy and report back on the experience. The results were really positive. We published them as a Nature commentary a year ago and decided to embark on a more formal standard setting project. And you can see the names of people here that are part of the working group that just completed a round of work that I'll tell you about. But the main thing to emphasize is that it's a cross-constituency group with people from funding, researchers, publishers, and institutional and library representatives as well, and also standards bodies. And this is being run under the jointly the auspices of NISO and of CASRE, which is the Consortia Advancing Standards in Research Administration Information based in Canada. We just published this taxonomy through a process of broad community consultation, which had included reaching out to the community, doing a survey, and arrived at a 14-term tag set that captures the high-level roles that function across most of the sciences. So you can see somewhat like that word cloud: conceptualization, methodology, software, validation, writing, supervision, et cetera. And all this is available at projectcredit.net. This is now part of the CASRAE data dictionary, which is a first step towards standardization. CASRAE can be viewed as the kind of front end to the more formal standard setting process. And we specify that these roles are intended to be used whether or not a publisher would consider that particular contribution to be qualification for authorship. Because part of the rationale for doing this is to actually draw attention to some of the roles that we're seeing now, data curation, coding, et cetera, that contribute to research publications, and so they can be used in acknowledgements as well. We also have some authority control around the role assignment, suggests that the corresponding author is responsible for the role assignment, but is assumed to be consulting with all of the contributors. So we have several initiatives using the taxonomy underway, and I'll go through a few of them quickly. The first to jump on board was Mozilla Science Labs in partnership with Biomed Central. And they created a set of open badges that are essentially appear in the browser when you're looking at a journal article. And it still requires the data to be provided by the publisher, but it is a browser-based visualization of the contributor roles. The Vivo project, Vivo is a research networking platform that's used in many institutions. It is integrating the taxonomy into its ontology. So you can imagine this information, for example, enriching the kinds of expertise search that research networking platforms enable. ORCID itself is also integrating the taxonomy. Currently, if you can see this, its contributor roles are highlighting job roles rather than contribution types. So it has things like co-inventor, investigator, postdoctoral researcher, and has plans to substitute in the credit taxonomy contributor roles. Crossref has expressed interest in doing a pilot. Symplectic Elements, which is one of the digital science companies, is also going to, that helps researchers and institutions manage academic information, will also be integrating in the taxonomy. Now, with those examples that I've talked about, we're largely talking about self-declaration of roles, apart from the Crossref example. In order for this data to truly be integrated into publishing metadata ecosystem, some other things have to happen. Among them, having the tags integrated into the JATS, NISO, NCBI Journal Article Tag Suite, and that is work that is underway. Manuscript tracking vendors are now getting on board. Aries Systems, for example, has said that they're going to announce this is support for the taxonomy as part of the next version, as has eJournal Press, although they're in a more exploratory phase. And several publishers, including PLOS, Science and Nature, are committed to being early adopters. 5 more minutes. Okay, but the vision here is really machine readability. So imagine contributor role metadata collected by publishers via the article submission tracking process, then deposited with Crossref. And I made up this thing, contribref, just like funref, but I'm sure there's a more clever label for it. And then ORCID, which is already pulling metadata from Crossref, can then link contributor roles to ORCIDs, which means that the ORCID system can be queried for not only which DOIs did this particular ORCID have a role in creating, but also then what contribution did this ORCID make to this particular DOI. And so effectively, evaluation committees could then pull an individual's authoritative contribution report from ORCID, and that might make the funding evaluation or appointment evaluation process look quite different. So that's the vision. We're not quite there yet. Short of the full metadata integration, these roles can certainly start being used and displayed in publications. This is just an example of the contribution statement from a paper on this project that just came out in Learned Publishing. And I think that's about it. There's more about this project at projectcredit.net, and we welcome any publishers who want to get on board. Thank you.